Kyiv suffers massive overnight attack from Russia with drones and missiles killing at least 18 people, including 4 children. Among those killed are children aged 2, 17, and 14, according to the head of the Kyiv City Military Administration, Timur Tkachenko. At least 10 children were also injured. Ukraine's Air Force said that the Kremlin unleashed 629 air attack weapons on the country overnight, comprising 598 drones and 31 missiles. Russia's defense ministry says it struck military-industrial complex enterprises and military air bases in Ukraine using high-precision weapons. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky called the assault a horrific and deliberate killing of civilians in a post on X.
At the time of the rocket attack, I was in the parking lot. Well, you could hear it very clearly in the parking lot too. Whistling, screeching, noise. And, well, I don't even know how to describe the feeling. And then, well, an explosion, probably right away. 1 and 3 minutes later another rocket hit. Then people started running over after the bombs had already gone off. They were all shaking and trembling. They were crying, you know. They didn't expect it. But they were crying and screaming. We were screaming too when the bombs went off.
An explosion. Glass was flying everywhere. Everything was sparkling. First of all, of course, I ran to my daughter's room. At first, I was in shock. We could hear people screaming. It started right away. Then we went out into the street. Everything was destroyed, everything was broken. If I had gone to the shelter a minute later, I would not be here now, I would have been buried. But we were lucky that we managed to get to the shelter in time. Then we were very lucky that we reacted to the smoke in time. There was a lot of smoke, but we didn't suffocate inside. And we were very lucky that there was no collapse, just the thin entrance to the shelter collapsed. If we hadn't gone out, we would have all suffocated in the shelter.
Well, the head of the European Union's Executive Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has spoken of her outrage at Russia's deadliest onslaught in Kyiv since July, which also damaged the EU's delegation office in the Ukrainian capital. 18 people, including 4 children, were killed and dozens more wounded in the bombardment. Ukrainian officials said that a 5-story residential building was destroyed and the EU office and nearby British Council were damaged. In a strongly worded statement, von der Leyen said that Russian missiles struck in close proximity to the diplomatic mission. 2 missiles hit in a distance of 50 meters of the delegation within 20 seconds. An EU spokeswoman said no diplomatic mission should ever be targeted, and the Russian charge d'affaires in Brussels was being summoned in response to the attack. The UK said Russia's ambassador to London, Andrei Kelin, will be summoned to the Foreign Office.
Unwavering support to Ukraine, our neighbor, partner, friend, and our future member. It shows that the Kremlin will stop at nothing to terrorize Ukraine, blindly killing civilians, men, women, and children, and even targeting the European Union. This is why we are keeping maximum pressure on Russia. That means tightening our sanctions regime. It was an attack also on our delegation. I just spoke with our deputy ambassador.
Well, and to discuss this in detail, we have international affairs analyst Dr. Marek Laskiewicz joining us from London. Marek, glad to have you join us. Well, concerning the peace talk, Putin's response was drone attacks, 18 people killed. What's your sense?
Well, Russia has always stated there will be no ceasefire of any sort. It'll have to be a total treaty. And therefore it is carrying on fighting or bombing, missiling, until, in fact, such a treaty is signed. It has done this before, it has done this recently, and it will carry on doing so because it actually sees an advancement in its military position and in sapping Ukraine's will to carry on, and that's why it's doing it and will continue to do this.
Well, Zelensky spoke. He says Putin is choosing missiles over ceasefire or peace. That he's not particularly interested, or it doesn't seem to be.
That's not entirely correct. What is correct is that President Putin has stated before he has no interest in a ceasefire. It must be a peace treaty. So therefore, that part of the sentence of Zelensky is redundant, because we knew that before. Again, it is stressed, until the peace treaty is signed, Russia will carry on fighting. They've said this before. And so therefore, there's nothing new here. But the second part of his sentence, which was that this shows that Russia is not interested in peace, this does not follow. It is merely that Russia is carrying on pressurizing Ukraine until it gets the peace treaty it wants, and therefore this will carry on happening. It does not mean that Russia is not interested in peace, but it wants peace on its terms, or at least negotiated in some way.
All this happening when EU was discussing security guarantees.
Yeah, the security guarantees of the EU to Ukraine are not of great interest to Russia. The only country that counts in its eyes, and indeed primarily, it is USA in military hardware and the quality. And therefore, this per se is irrelevant to Russia. What is relevant is whether the EU will be purchasing US arms, as President Donald Trump has offered, to supply to Ukraine. Now, that would be important. But as things stand, that the EU was making this discussion is not very relevant in Russian eyes. And in truth be told, it is of interest, but it's not vital in analyzing how the war will turn out.
Russia, talking about security guarantees, Russia says it does not accept any of such.
Yeah, this whole issue of security guarantees, which President Zelensky and the EU regard as extremely important, to be honest, it's very hard to see why. Ukraine had absolutely rock-solid guarantees in 1994. And so what? They were broken, and that's that. So quite what he's looking for in the security guarantees is somewhat of a mystery, except, of course, in terms of PR. Moreover, if we are going to go for what is important, then President Putin's trip to China with North Korea, that is easily as important as the EU security meeting. And as for what President Zelensky wants, the problem is that his views of what should be the peace, namely that Russia should leave all occupied territories, possibly paying reparations, and what the Russians want, which is a fair slice of Ukrainian territory, is so far apart that it's unlikely in the immediate future to be realized. And as for security guarantees, they are actually a secondary issue in it.
Trump says U.S. envoy Witkoff is meeting with Putin, his words or phrase, highly productive. What do you read into Putin's actions, his mind, and what Trump is saying? What does even productive mean?
President Putin made some minor concessions, which were the first concessions he'd ever offered anybody in this course of this war. And he said that he'd be prepared to cease fighting, given that the rest of his conditions are met. That is to say, a huge amount of territory will be ceded de jure to Russia, and so on. It is productive in the sense that Russian demands are clearly laid out. There was a minor concession. From Ukraine's point of view, all this is irrelevant because they don't want any part of Russia to have its territory, and therefore it's not seen as productive. But Trump sees it as a first step. He regards negotiations as a type of deal and sees Russia's setting out its stall as merely the first stage in the process. That's how I read it, and that's why he regarded it as productive, because he has a clear view has been made of what Russia wants.
Now, Trump wants that he will impose sanctions if Putin refuses to agree to a ceasefire. Now, this is not the first time that Trump has said this.
Yeah, what is interesting about this is that in respect to Russia, Trump is bark and no bite. He certainly has barked out before about sanctions, about this and that. In India, nothing's happened. So we must presume that once again, this is nothing more than simply a negotiating ploy, and that he won't actually be clamping on sanctions. President Trump has sort of backed himself into a corner in that he really does want a peace treaty to be signed, and therefore he would prefer this to happen. And if he implements too harsh a sanctions policy, this might have the effect of having the Russians dig in. It is unclear that sanctions per se will break Russia. As I stated by the start of the war, and still do, it's arms that Ukraine needs, arms from USA. The sanctions per se will not be the key. And there, of course, there are problems on that issue because Donald Trump doesn't like supplying arms because of the financial aspect, and also because, like the previous administration, is worried about that it might escalate the war if he oversupplies Ukraine.
Then that just seems to leave, including Trump, Ukraine, at the mercy of Putin. But Russia's special representative Kirill Dmitriev posted on social media, dialogue will prevail. This at a time Russia was launching drones. I am thinking, I don't know how you see it, there cannot be a disconnect between Dmitriev and his principal, Putin. But then the question is, he posts this, is he goading the world?
No, the Russians are interested in a peace treaty on their terms. And in this case, the point that dialogue will prevail is indeed the Russian hope in its way that by constantly working with America, they will arrive at a peace treaty which is favorable to them. And the Russians believe this to be the case because America is so strong and so important in the world. And so the fact that they are simultaneously missiling Ukraine is simply by putting pressure on Ukraine. If you like, the Americans, by threatening sanctions, are trying to pressurize America. The EU, by actually, I think, implementing sanctions, are equally pressurizing Russia. And Russia, in this case, is pressurizing Ukraine. This is all part of the process. There is a very famous quote by Clausewitz, the writer, military writer, that war is diplomacy by other means. And so here we have Russia engaging in both diplomacy and the military, i.e. diplomacy by other means. And so it's by no means unusual. It's not a contradiction in terms. And this is the situation which will carry on for some time, as far as one can see.
I was just wondering in my mind, which should come first, really? A ceasefire or peace treaty?
Well, if both sides see a ceasefire as being a good idea because they've reached a sort of stalemate, then indeed the ceasefire usually occurs first. It is, or if one side capitulates. This is what happened in World War I, when there was a ceasefire before the peace treaty, simply because Germany said it had surrendered, is no longer prepared to carry on fighting. In both those cases, you're right, the ceasefire comes first. But strictly speaking, there need be no ceasefire until the peace treaty. And if one side sees it advantageous to carry on pressing because it may well secure more territory or better terms, there will be no ceasefire. And this is by no means unusual in the world. The peace treaty negotiations are not part and parcel of the ceasefire ones. However, from Ukraine's point of view, it's precisely the other way around. A ceasefire would be excellent. It will enable them to regroup their forces. It will enable them to have some respite from the constant missiling, which would bolster the morale of the population. And so for precisely the same reason as Russia does not want a ceasefire, Ukraine wants a ceasefire. And so therefore that's why President Zelensky keeps harping on this point. But no, there's no strictly necessary a ceasefire before a peace treaty. It is often the case, but need not be.
Which works to the advantage of Putin, apparently. All right, we'll leave it there. Dr. Marek Laskiewicz is joining us from London. Thank you so much.